Our presentation is on trade and economic crisis. The Great Trade Collapse occurred between the third quarter of 2008 and the second quarter of 2009. Signs are that it has ended and recovery has begun, but it is by far the steepest fall of world trade in recorded history and the deepest fall since the Great Depression. The drop was sudden, severe, and perfectly timed. A few facts justify the label, the Great Trade Collapse. Global trade has dropped before, 3 times since World War II, but this is by far the largest. As Figure 1 shows, global trade fell for at least 3 quarters during 3 of the worldwide recessions that have occurred since 1965. The oil shock recession of 1974-75, the inflation-defeating recession of 1982-83, and the tech wreck recession of 2001-02. Specifically, the 1982 and 2001 drops were comparatively mild, with growth from previous year's quarter reaching -5% at most. The 1970s event was twice that size, with growth stumbling to -11%. The 2008 collapse was much worse. For 2 quarters in a row, world trade flows have been 15% below their previous year's levels. The Great Trade Collapse is not as large as that of the Great Depression, but it is much steeper. It took 24 months in the Great Depression for the world trade to fall as far as it fell in the 9 months from November 2008. All 104 nations on which the World Trade Organization reports data experienced a drop in both imports and exports during the second half of 2008 and the first half of 2009. Figure 3 shows how imports and exports collapsed for the European Union and 10 other nations that together account for 3 quarters of world trade. Each of these trade flows dropped by more than 20% from 2008 quarter 2 to 2009 quarter 2. Many fell 30% or more. World trade in almost every product category was positive in 2008 quarter 2. Almost all were negative in 2008 quarter 4, and all were negative in 2009 quarter 1. Manufacturers and commodities. Trade collapsed across the board, but it was important to distinguish between commodities and manufacturers. The collapse in minerals and oil trade started from a boom time and fell faster than total trade. The reason was prices. Food, materials, and especially oil experienced a steep run in price in early 2008. The boom ended in mid-2008, well before September 2008 Lehman debacle. The price of manufacturers, by contrast, was rather steady in this period. Since food, fuels, and raw materials make up about a quarter of global trade, these price movements had a big impact on aggregate trade figures. Trade and GDP. Given the global recession, a drop in global trade is unsurprising. The question is, why was it so big? Specifically, world trade dropped 4.8 times more than GDP. This time, the drop was far larger. From a historical perspective, the drop is astonishing. The figure shows the trade to GDP ratio rising steeply in the late 1990s before stagnating in the new century, right up to the Great Trade Collapse in 2008. Economists around the world have been working hard to understand the causes of this unusually large and abrupt shutdown of international trade. When sales dropped sharply in the Great Trade Collapse was a gigantic drop in international sales. Economists look for demand shocks and/or supply shocks. Demand shock. The emerging consensus is that the Great Trade Collapse was mostly a demand shock, although supply-side factors played some role. The demand shock operated through 2 distinct but mutually reinforcing channels. Commodity prices, which tumbled when the price bubble burst in mid-2008, continued to follow world demand in its downturn spiral. The price movements and diminished demand sent the value and volume of commodities trade diving. The production and exports of manufacturing collapsed as the Lehman's-induced shock and awe caused consumers and firms to wait and see. Private demand for all manner of postponed able consumption crashed.
The dollar and budget deficit. The value of the dollar is under attack on two fronts. Firstly, private investors are driving it lower in the foreign exchange markets. And secondly, monetary authorities are questioning its role as the world's key currency. The common factor between these attacks is the prospect of U.S. budget deficits near $1 trillion annually for the next decade would ignite fears of renewed inflation in the international community. In 2008, a modest further fall in the value of the dollar, mainly against a few other Asian currencies, would have actually been needed to restore full price competitiveness for the U.S. in world trade, and to sustain the decline in the current account deficit that has accompanied the recession. It's important that credible and lasting correction of the budget deficit is essential to protect the U.S. dollar against further attacks on its international value and its continuing vital role in the global monetary system. Now, prospects for the global trading system. The collapse of trade in the immediate aftermath of the Lehman Brothers took the entire world by surprise. It was unprecedented in the sharp rate of decline. This can be seen in Figure 1, which shows a comparison between the 1929 Wall Street crash and the 2008 recession. You can see 2008, it just drops like a stone, very steep decline. And while there were a large number of protectionist measures, the volume of trade affected was actually much smaller than you might think, given the severity of the 2008 downturn. That probably reflects recognition of the extensive benefits of maintaining a multilateral trading system. Now, at the same time, it's increasingly recognized that global imbalances and the low real interest rate that resulted from them were a major contributing factor to the crisis. If the open and multilateral trading system is revitalized and the international financial systems are addressed, the international economy can continue the current upturn and accelerate growth. Now, you can also take a bit more of a negative viewpoint of this. Some may say that the severity of the recession disillusioned many people, and in the future, there will be a lot more protectionist pressure and measures. This is in the aftermath of the 2008 recession. Now, if protectionism were to increase, the consequences over a long term would be very detrimental. Exporters will invest less, and real incomes will grow more slowly. And the efforts at policy reform in poor countries will be more difficult, and the payoffs will be smaller than in more prosperous international economies. And there would also be a higher likelihood that people would resort to increasing regionalism and preferential trading agreements without the necessary strengthening of the open multilateral trading system. Now let's talk about global trade in the aftermath of a global crisis. Rebalancing global trade is a very difficult task, as you have to fight against the substantial protectionist pressures. To manage these pressures, governments must maintain domestic political support for an open world economy. The ultimate cause of the current crisis was the global macroeconomic imbalances that accumulated over the course of more than a decade before 2008. Now, economic agents in deficit countries who are accustomed to easy credit and booming consumption will now face austerity measures and slow growth at home. In surplus countries, producers who have become accustomed to easy exports and rarely face trade competition are going to find the new international environment to be much less welcoming. And in deficit countries, there will be protectionist pressures to try and reduce imports, and pressures to open foreign markets to increase exports. Obviously, the inverse will also be happening in surplus countries, where there will be pressures from previously economically and politically dominant exporters to maintain government support for them in the face of external hostility. Now, there are two very important points that policymakers must consider. Governments need to address the underlying macroeconomic causes of the crisis and work together in an attempt to smooth the way towards macroeconomic adjustment. And given the heightened political sensitivity to international trade relations, attempts to extend the rulemaking features of the World Trade Organization or other elements of the international trading system are most likely going to be irrelevant and could actually be quite harmful. The most productive way forward is likely to be to encourage imaginative and flexible policies on the part of major trading partners and international institutions. And the world will be going through a very difficult rebalancing phase with important economic, social, and political implications for almost all major nations. It's crucial for the world to maintain and strengthen an integrated international trading system.
Government policies and the collapse in trade during the Great Depression. Governments should guard against compliance in their outlook against protectionism. On 15 November 2008, world leaders gathered in Washington, D.C. for the first of a series of summits on the global financial crisis and its economic fallout. G20 leaders pledged to avoid protectionism for 12 months, raising concerns in the mind of some that failure to meet this pledge had reinforced the harm done to international trade by falling demand and limited trade finance. Crisis-era protectionism 1 year after the November 2008 summit. It now contains 606 state measures whose implementation was thought to possibly affect foreign commercial interest. Of the 606 state measures investigated, 402 have already been implemented. Much of their liberation involves freeing up foreign direct investment regimes and lowering tariffs on non-finished goods. Nearly 3/4 of implemented measures have almost certainly discriminated against foreign commercial interests. Since taking their pledge to refrain from protectionism, G20 governments have together implemented 179 measures that harm foreign trade, investments, workers, and intellectual property. On average, every other day, a G20 government has broken the pledge made in Washington, D.C. last November. Implementation of what might be referred to as this protectionist overhang would expand the number of discriminatory measures by 50%. Discriminatory measures implemented. Financial assistance packages are the most popular discriminatory instrument, accounting for a third of all harmful measures employed. This is followed by anti-dumping, countervailing duty, and safeguard actions, which collectively account for 20% of harmful measures implemented. Tariff increases account for 1/7 of the total, and every other form of discriminatory state measures for less than 5% of total measures. Of the 101 such packages found to be discriminatory in the JTA database, just under 60% targeted sectors other than banking, finance, and insurance. Nations implementing discriminatory state measures are Russia, China, Indonesia, Argentina, Germany, UK, and the US, which are in the top 10 worst offenders. What it means for protectionist dynamic. Since the first G20 crisis-related summit in November 2008, the largest trading nations have undertaken about trend levels of discrimination against foreign commercial interests. The most frequently used form of protectionism was financial bailout, mainly to the manufacturing sector. Across the broad, tariff increases themselves only account for 1/7 of all discriminatory measures. The next 6 to 12 months are likely to see a return to a resort to trade remedies, which is the traditional discriminatory tool used in recent recessions. The extent to which a nation's commercial interests are targeted by other trading partners is well accounted for by its total exports and national income. This is particularly true of the most targeted nations. Impact on global imbalances. The global crises have been accompanied by an unpredicted collapse in world trade. The emerging consensus is that this was a demand-driven collapse. The rapid collapse of trade between the third quarter of 2008 and the first quarter of 2009 improved most balances of trade. As a matter of pure logic, a rapid fall in both imports and exports produces an equal rapid drop in the absolute gap between them. The deficit nations like the US and the UK saw remarkable improvements, as did the surplus nations, especially Japan. The biggest imbalanced nations. The trade collapse for the US meant a rapid fall in both its exports and imports, but a more rapid fall in its imports. China, there also seems to have been some adjustment since its exports fell more than its imports up to February 2009. Since that month, however, Chinese trade has recovered rapidly, with export growth somewhat faster. Germany's trade balance also improved with the trade collapse. From a 2008 peak of 30 billion to surplus fell to under 10 billion. The great trade collapse was primarily driven by a sudden, synchronized, and severe drop in demand. Macroeconomics and supply chain trade. International supply chains have changed the nature of international trade and its role in the transmission of shocks. Trade growth is likely to bring back the large global imbalances observed in recent years. The balance of two factors will govern the outcome of the medium run. Structural changes necessary to rebalance trade accounts and rapid exports and import growth that will worsen trade accounts.